March 31st, 1913. In a quiet suite at the Grand Hotel in Rome, J.P. Morgan lies dying. The mustached titan who once summoned presidents, who reorganized railroads with a handshake, who halted the Panic of 1907 by sheer force of reputation, no longer commands anything, not markets, not men, not even his own failing heart. When word of his death reaches New York, the New York Stock Exchange closes for 2 hours in his honor. It is an extraordinary tribute. Nations had depended on his credit. Governments had sought his approval. Yet the empire he leaves behind is not only measured in bonds and balance sheets. It stands in stone and brick, in manicured lawns overlooking the Hudson, in guarded gates along Long Island's North Shore, and in a marble-walled sanctuary of books on Madison Avenue. In Manhattan, just steps from his private residence, rises the temple he built to permanence, the J.P. Morgan Library. Completed in 1906 and designed by architect Charles Follen McKim, it was not intended for public admiration. It was a fortress of culture, housing medieval manuscripts, Renaissance paintings, and some of the rarest printed works on earth. Inside, light filters through high windows onto red velvet and carved walnut shelves. Outside, carriages once waited while financiers and European dealers passed quietly through its doors. Morgan believed that financial authority required cultural authority. The library was not decoration. It was a declaration, but the library was only one piece of a wider geography. North of the city, along the Hudson River near Highland Falls, stood Cragston, his country retreat with commanding views of the water. On Long Island at Matinacock Point in Glen Cove, acres of private land shielded him from the noise of the city he controlled. These were not leisure homes in the modern sense. They were extensions of power, spaces where industrial strategy and private negotiation unfolded away from public scrutiny. Servants, gardeners, caretakers, drivers. Each estate functioned like a small municipality sustained by Morgan's fortune. But to understand Morgan is to understand scale. At the height of his influence, his banking house, J.P. Morgan and Company, helped finance the formation of U.S. Steel and General Electric. He orchestrated the rescue of the American banking system in 1907 by locking rival bankers in his library until they agreed on a plan to stop the panic. Presidents consulted him. Congress investigated him. Cartoonists depicted him as a colossus straddling Wall Street. Yet for all his dominance, he invested heavily in something fragile: land, architecture, permanence. And that is the mystery. Financial empires rise and fall with markets. But estates, stone buildings, carved staircases, acres of guarded lawns suggest endurance. They imply dynastic intention. Morgan built not merely to live, but to establish presence. He assembled properties the way he assembled companies, consolidating influence into physical form. And yet, today, much of that private landscape has vanished or transformed beyond recognition. The lawns subdivided, the mansions repurposed, the private sanctuaries opened to the public. Morgan stabilized markets, shaped industries, and left an indelible mark on American capitalism. But the empire of land he constructed, his private kingdom of estates, quietly dissolved into the 20th century. The question is not how powerful he was. That is well documented. The question is what happened to the geography of that power after the man himself was gone. Long before the skyscrapers of Wall Street defined American finance, there were quieter landscapes where power truly rested: rolling lawns, stone facades, and private libraries built not for show, but for control. After consolidating his dominance over railroads, steel, and banking in the late 19th century, J.P. Morgan began shaping a different kind of empire, one constructed not of corporations, but of estates. These properties were not mere retreats from business. They were extensions of it. In them, Morgan cultivated influence, negotiated alliances, and preserved the intellectual foundations of his authority. To understand the scale of his private world is to understand how American power functioned in the Gilded Age, quietly, personally, and behind closed doors. By the 1880s and 1890s, Morgan's financial career had reached staggering heights. Through the firm that would become J.P. Morgan and Company, he orchestrated the reorganization of railroads, stabilized the U.S. Treasury during the Panic of 1895, and later played a central role in the creation of U.S. Steel. Yet while newspapers chronicled his boardroom triumphs, they rarely mentioned the spaces where many of his most consequential decisions were prepared. Morgan understood that privacy was a strategic asset. Unlike the flamboyant magnates of his era, he did not seek palatial publicity. His estates were designed not to impress the masses, but to command respect among equals. In New York City, Morgan maintained a brownstone residence on Madison Avenue, a restrained yet formidable structure that reflected his disciplined persona. It was here, in richly paneled rooms lined with rare manuscripts and Renaissance art, that Morgan cultivated his identity not just as a financier, but as a guardian of culture. Adjacent to his home stood what would become one of the most significant private libraries in the world, the institution now known as the Morgan Library and Museum. Originally constructed to house his vast collection of medieval manuscripts, early printed books, and classical drawings, the library was a declaration of intellectual sovereignty. Morgan collected with the same intensity that he consolidated industries. Each acquisition signaled discernment, reach, and permanence, but Morgan's empire extended beyond Manhattan's stone corridors. In the Hudson Valley, he owned expansive country property that allowed him to retreat from the volatility of the markets. These estates provided more than leisure. They offered strategic seclusion. Fellow financiers, industrialists, and political figures could visit away from prying eyes, forging understandings that would later reshape corporations and economies. In an age before electronic communication, influence required proximity. Morgan's country residences provided it in abundance. Across the Atlantic, his presence was equally deliberate. Morgan's European connections were essential to his banking operations, and he maintained residences in London and elsewhere that reflected his transnational authority. His London house positioned him within reach of the Bank of England and Europe's financial aristocracy. In these spaces, Morgan operated as both American titan and international intermediary, reinforcing the networks that enabled his firm to float massive loans and underwrite global ventures. What defined these estates was not extravagance alone, but orchestration. Morgan designed environments that reinforced hierarchy. Guests were carefully selected. Conversations were purposeful. His properties functioned as theaters of power where decisions unfolded without spectacle. Unlike Newport's social palaces, which dazzled with opulence, Morgan's homes conveyed gravity. They were places where alliances were tested and trust was measured in silence as much as speech. The Forgotten Empire of J.P. Morgan's private estates reveals a crucial truth about the Gilded Age. Power was not only accumulated in markets, it was sustained in rooms. Within these walls, art became diplomacy, hospitality became negotiation, and privacy became leverage. Morgan understood that true authority required architecture, and he built accordingly. If Wall Street was the engine of J.P. Morgan's power, then his country estate at Craigston was its hidden command post. Perched above the Hudson River near Highland Falls, New York, Craigston was not conceived as a social playground in the manner of Newport's marble palaces. It was something quieter, more controlled, and in many ways more revealing. Built in the late 19th century, the house commanded sweeping views of the river and the surrounding highlands, landscapes that seemed almost deliberately chosen to reflect stability and permanence. Yet beneath its serene exterior, Craigston functioned as a private arena where some of the most consequential economic conversations of the era took place. Here, removed from the telegraph wires and newspaper reporters of Manhattan, Morgan convened railroad executives, steel magnates, and political intermediaries to settle disputes that could destabilize entire industries. The estate's power lay precisely in its distance. By gathering rivals under one roof, he could enforce compromise face to face, a method he believed far more effective than public confrontation. That Morgan's approach to negotiation was deeply personal. He preferred direct engagement, reading expressions, testing resolve, and measuring silence as carefully as spoken words. Craigston provided the ideal setting for this style. Guests would arrive by rail or river, ascending to the estate through winding drives that heightened anticipation. Once inside, the tone shifted from leisure to deliberation. Morgan's imposing presence, stocky, intense, and marked by the rosacea that gave his nose its famous purplish hue, dominated the room. Conversations that might have faltered in corporate offices often reached resolution here, under his watchful gaze. It was during such private gatherings that Morgan enforced discipline within the railroad industry, compelling competing lines to abandon ruinous rate wars and accept rationalized agreements. The estate became a crucible where modern corporate order was forged. Yet Craigston was only one component of Morgan's carefully structured private empire. His Madison Avenue residence in New York stood directly adjacent to what would become the Morgan Library and Museum, a building he commissioned not merely as a repository of books, but as a statement of intellectual authority. Designed by architect Charles Follen McKim and completed in 1906, the library embodied Renaissance grandeur transplanted into American soil. Its interior, richly ornamented ceilings, marble columns, and murals inspired by classical themes, signaled Morgan's belief that financial power should be matched by cultural stewardship. He amassed illuminated manuscripts, Gutenberg Bibles, rare classical texts, and old master drawings with the same strategic precision that he applied to corporate mergers. In doing so, he elevated himself beyond the stereotype of the ruthless industrial financier. He became a collector whose acquisitions rivaled those of European aristocracy, reinforcing his standing among the transatlantic elite. But Morgan's estates also reflected his deep ties to Europe. His banking house, J.P. Morgan & Company, operated in close coordination with its London counterpart, Morgan Grenfell. In London, Morgan maintained a residence that allowed him proximity to the Bank of England and Britain's financial establishment. These European properties were not ostentatious displays. They were operational hubs in a global network of capital. When American markets trembled, as they did during the Panic of 1907, Morgan's influence depended on his credibility abroad. The relationships cultivated in drawing rooms and private dining chambers across the Atlantic strengthened his capacity to mobilize gold reserves and restore confidence. The estate, once again, functioned as infrastructure, less visible than a railroad line, but equally essential to the architecture of power. What distinguished Morgan from many of his contemporaries was the discipline with which he curated these environments. While families like the Vanderbilts embraced conspicuous display in Newport, Morgan favored gravity. His interiors were dominated not by gilded excess, but by art and scholarship. The message was subtle yet unmistakable. His authority derived not only from wealth, but from cultivation. Visitors encountered rare tapestries, Renaissance paintings, and meticulously arranged shelves of incunabula. Each object reinforced a narrative of permanence and discernment. In a nation barely a century old, Morgan was constructing a lineage of taste that connected American finance to European tradition. The rhythm of life at these estates followed Morgan's own relentless schedule. Even in the countryside, mornings began with correspondence and financial reports. Secretaries and associates traveled with him, ensuring that business continued uninterrupted. Afternoons might include horseback rides or quiet moments in the library, but evenings often returned to discussion. Guests understood that hospitality came with expectation. Morgan listened carefully, intervened decisively, and left little ambiguity about outcomes. Many industrial disputes that threatened economic chaos were resolved not in courtrooms, but at his dining table. The physical landscapes of his estates amplified this authority. Craigston's commanding views suggested oversight. The Madison Avenue Library conveyed intellectual dominion. The London residence signaled international reach. Together, they formed a constellation of spaces where American capitalism was quietly choreographed. These were not accidental acquisitions, but deliberate instruments. Morgan recognized that environment shapes perception, and perception shapes power. By controlling the setting, he controlled the narrative as the 20th century approached. Criticism of concentrated financial power intensified. Progressive reformers questioned whether one man should wield such influence over national credit. Yet even as public scrutiny grew, Morgan's estates remained insulated worlds. Behind stone facades and guarded gates, negotiations continued, alliances solidified, and art collections expanded. The private empire endured because it was adaptable, rooted not only in property but in relationships sustained within those walls. To walk the grounds of Craigston today is to sense an echo of that era, a time when the fate of railroads, banks, and even the federal government could hinge on conversations held far from public view. Morgan's estates remind us that the architecture of American power was never confined to skyscrapers. It was cultivated in drawing rooms overlooking the Hudson, in libraries lined with medieval parchment, and in quiet London salons where gold shipments were arranged with a handshake. In these places, J.P. Morgan exercised a form of authority that transcended balance sheets. His private estates were not retreats from empire. They were the very rooms in which it was sustained. To be why the dawn of the 20th century, the name J.P. Morgan no longer represented merely a financier. It signified a stabilizing force in moments of national uncertainty. Yet the foundation of that authority did not rest solely within the marble corridors of Wall Street. It was reinforced within the guarded intimacy of his private spaces, where strategy unfolded away from the spectacle of public scrutiny. Among the most revealing chapters of Morgan's private empire is the way his estates became operational headquarters during crises, particularly in periods when the American financial system trembled at the edge of collapse. These properties were not passive symbols of wealth. They were active arenas where the architecture of modern finance was reinforced under immense pressure. The Panic of 1907 stands as the clearest demonstration of how Morgan's private world functioned as a parallel government of capital. When a failed attempt to corner the market in United Copper triggered a cascade of bank runs and trust company failures, fear spread rapidly through New York's financial district. The United States had no central bank at the time. The Federal Reserve would not be established until 1913. In that vacuum, Morgan assumed the role of de facto central banker. Though the most intense meetings occurred at his library on Madison Avenue, adjacent to what is now the Morgan Library and Museum, the broader network of his estates formed the backdrop to this emergency mobilization. Wealthy associates were summoned not through public announcements, but through private channels, many of them cultivated during gatherings at Cragston or in his European residences. The trust forged in those quieter settings now became the currency that steadied markets. Inside his Madison Avenue library, Morgan famously locked leading bankers in a room until they agreed to contribute funds to rescue faltering institutions. That dramatic gesture has entered financial folklore, yet its effectiveness relied on relationships forged long before the panic erupted. Those relationships were nurtured over dinners overlooking the Hudson, during intimate conversations in paneled libraries, and across Atlantic crossings between New York and London. Morgan's estate culture emphasized loyalty, hierarchy, and personal accountability. When crisis demanded swift coordination, the social bonds formed within those walls translated into financial commitments measured in millions of dollars. Morgan's European connections proved equally critical. Through J.P. Morgan and Company and its London affiliate Morgan Grenfell, he maintained deep ties with British financial houses. His residence in London placed him within reach of the Bank of England and the European gold market. During periods of American instability, Morgan's credibility abroad allowed him to secure gold imports that bolstered U.S. reserves. These negotiations were rarely conducted in crowded offices. They unfolded in private drawing rooms where reputation carried more weight than contracts. The estates served as diplomatic chambers, where American needs were framed within the language of transatlantic partnership at the same time. Morgan's properties embodied a philosophy of order that contrasted sharply with the volatility of the markets he dominated. His homes were meticulously arranged, reflecting his belief that structure, whether in architecture or in industry, was essential to stability. The same impulse that drove him to reorganize chaotic railroads into rational systems guided the environment he curated. Art collections were cataloged with precision, manuscripts preserved in controlled conditions, and guests seated according to unspoken hierarchies. The physical order of his estates mirrored the financial order he sought to impose on the American economy. Critics, however, viewed this consolidation of private power with suspicion. Progressive reformers argued that no individual, regardless of competence, should command such influence over national credit. The spectacle of Morgan orchestrating rescue operations from his library reinforced fears that democracy was yielding to oligarchy. Yet within his estates, Morgan saw his actions not as usurpation, but as stewardship. He believed that concentrated authority, exercised responsibly, prevented greater chaos. The absence of a central banking system left a vacuum he felt compelled to fill. In his view, the disciplined environment of his private empire was preferable to the disorder of unregulated competition. The cultural dimension of his estates further strengthened his claim to legitimacy. Morgan's collection of Renaissance art and rare manuscripts was not simply an indulgence. It positioned him as a custodian of civilization. In an era when American wealth was often caricatured as crude and newly minted, his library suggested continuity with European tradition. The illuminated manuscripts and early printed Bibles housed within those walls conveyed permanence, scholarship, and refinement. Guests who stepped into that chamber encountered a narrative that framed Morgan not merely as a banker, but as a patron of culture. The setting subtly reframed discussions of power, placing financial decisions within a broader context of legacy and responsibility. Even Morgan's retreats away from New York reinforced this carefully balanced image. At Cragston, the rhythm of estate life combined leisure with deliberation. Morning rides along wooded paths were followed by sessions of correspondence, evenings by discussions that extended into the night. Associates understood that an invitation carried weight. To be summoned to one of Morgan's properties signaled both trust and expectation. Within those boundaries, rivalries softened under the pressure of proximity. Morgan's physical presence, often described as formidable and unyielding, was amplified by the environment he controlled. The estate became an extension of his authority. As federal reforms gradually reshaped the financial system, culminating in the creation of the Federal Reserve shortly after Morgan's death in 1913. The era of private financial governance began to recede, yet the imprint of his estate-based power remained. The Panic of 1907 demonstrated both the effectiveness and the peril of concentrated authority. It revealed how personal networks cultivated in drawing rooms could stabilize a nation, but it also underscored the fragility of relying on a single figure. Morgan's private empire functioned as a bridge between an unregulated past and an institutionalized future. When Morgan died in Rome in 1913, tributes poured in from across the Atlantic. Markets paused in recognition of his passing, a testament to the scale of his influence. But behind the public mourning lay the quieter legacy of his estates. The Madison Avenue Library would eventually open to the public, transforming from private sanctuary to cultural institution. Cragston, though less celebrated, remained a symbol of the era when private landscapes hosted decisions of public consequence. The London residents continued to echo with the history of transatlantic finance. In examining these spaces, one recognizes that Morgan's empire was never confined to ledgers or stock certificates. It was constructed in rooms where trust was negotiated face-to-face, in libraries where art framed authority, and in country houses where compromise was compelled under the weight of personal presence. His estates were not ornamental backdrops. They were operational centers in a time before centralized regulation. Through them, Morgan demonstrated that architecture, environment, and social ritual could become instruments of economic command. The forgotten empire of J.P. Morgan's private estates thus reveals a dimension of power often overlooked. It was not only the scale of his wealth that shaped history, but the spaces in which he chose to exercise it. Within those walls, American capitalism matured, crisis was confronted, and a new financial order took shape. Long after the debates about his methods have faded, the quiet grandeur of those estates continues to remind us that, in the Gilded Age, the most decisive acts of leadership often occurred far from public view, beneath carved ceilings and beside shelves of ancient parchment. Where one man's resolve could steady an entire nation, as the 20th century advanced and the industrial age matured, the private empire of J.P. Morgan began to reveal a deeper purpose beyond negotiation and crisis management. It became a carefully constructed legacy. Morgan understood that wealth alone was fleeting unless anchored to institutions that would outlive him. His estates, particularly his Madison Avenue residence and the adjoining library that would become the Morgan Library and Museum, were conceived not merely as personal sanctuaries, but as vessels of permanence. Within those stone walls, illuminated manuscripts and Renaissance paintings formed a narrative about continuity, taste, and authority that transcended quarterly profits or temporary market dominance. Morgan was acutely aware that the age of individual financial titans was giving way to a more regulated era, and he sought to ensure that his name would be associated, not only with consolidation and crisis intervention, but with cultural stewardship. The transformation of his private library into a public institution did not occur instantly upon his death in 1913, but the groundwork had been laid during his lifetime. Morgan collected with an intensity that rivaled European monarchs, acquiring treasures such as early printed Bibles, medieval manuscripts, and drawings by masters like Raphael and Michelangelo. These acquisitions were not random indulgences. They were deliberate acts of preservation. At a time when Europe's aristocratic collections were often dispersed due to financial strain, Morgan's capital enabled him to secure objects that might otherwise have been lost or fragmented. Critics sometimes accused him of stripping Europe of its heritage, yet he viewed himself as a custodian transferring fragile legacies to a rising American power. The estate, therefore, became a bridge between continents, linking Old World tradition with New World ambition. Beyond Manhattan, the future of his country estate at Cragston illustrated another dimension of his legacy. Though less publicized than the library, the Hudson River property symbolized an era when American finance was governed as much by personal authority as by institutional oversight. After Morgan's death, the locus of economic control shifted steadily toward regulatory frameworks and federal structures. The creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, just months before he passed away, institutionalized many functions that Morgan had personally performed during crises like the Panic of 1907. In that sense, his estates marked the end of one chapter and the threshold of another. They stood as monuments to a time when one man's drawing room could stabilize markets. But they also foreshadowed the limits of such concentrated power. But Morgan's heirs faced the delicate task of managing this inheritance. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., assumed leadership of J.P. Morgan and Company and continued the firm's influential role in international finance, particularly during World War I when it arranged massive loans to Allied governments. Yet the younger Morgan operated in a different climate. Public scrutiny of financial elites intensified, and the populist distrust of concentrated wealth deepened in the aftermath of war and economic upheaval. The private estate, once a shield of discretion, became a symbol scrutinized by reformers who questioned the social legitimacy of inherited power. The grandeur that had once conveyed stability now risked appearing detached from democratic accountability. Still, the architectural and cultural imprint of Morgan's estates endured. The Morgan Library evolved into a research institution and museum, opening its collections to scholars and the public. What had once been an intimate chamber for private study transformed into a civic space of learning. This transition mirrored a broader transformation in American society, where private wealth increasingly sought validation through philanthropy. Morgan himself had not been as overtly philanthropic as contemporaries like Andrew Carnegie, yet his cultural investments ultimately achieved a similar public dimension. The preservation of rare manuscripts and artworks provided enduring educational value. Reframing his legacy in terms of contribution rather than accumulation, the physical spaces also carried an emotional resonance. Visitors to the library today encounter not just artifacts but atmosphere, the hushed reverence of vaulted ceilings, the intricate murals, the sense of stepping into a world designed to inspire contemplation. That atmosphere was intentional. Morgan believed that surroundings shaped intellect, and he curated his environment to reflect discipline and refinement. The estate functioned as an extension of character, projecting the seriousness with which he approached both art and finance. Even after the mechanisms of his private financial governance faded, the mood of authority lingered within those walls. In examining the broader historical arc, one sees how Morgan's private empire intersected with the transformation of American capitalism. The Gilded Age had celebrated individual magnates who amassed fortunes through consolidation and speculation. By the Progressive Era, society demanded regulation, transparency, and institutional balance. Morgan's estates straddled this divide. They were born in an age of personal dominance, but survived into an era of systemic oversight. Their endurance illustrates how architecture and culture can outlast economic paradigms. The symbolism of these estates also extended internationally. Morgan's connections in London and his role in transatlantic finance reinforced America's emergence as a global economic power. His private residences abroad, though less frequently discussed, underscored the global scope of his influence. They were nodes in a network that linked Wall Street to European capitals, enabling the flow of capital and gold that underpinned industrial expansion. Even after his death, the institutional successors to his firm maintained those transatlantic ties, shaping international finance for decades. Ultimately, the forgotten empire of J.P. Morgan's private estates tells a story not only of wealth but of transition. These properties were arenas of negotiation, sanctuaries of art, and symbols of authority. They sheltered conversations that influenced railroads, steel corporations, and national credit. They housed collections that connected America to centuries of European culture. And they stood at the crossroads of two financial eras, one governed by individual will, the other by institutional design. When Morgan died in Rome, far from the estates that had anchored his power, markets across the globe paused in acknowledgement. Yet it was in New York, within the library he had so carefully assembled, that the most enduring testament to his vision would unfold. The estate that once guarded his privacy gradually opened its doors to the public, transforming from a fortress of influence into a beacon of scholarship. In that transformation lies the paradox of Morgan's legacy. The private empire he built to consolidate authority ultimately became a public inheritance, through stone facades and vaulted ceilings. Through preserved manuscripts and curated galleries, the echo of his presence remains. His estates remind us that power is not solely measured in financial statements, but in the institutions and environments one leaves behind. In their quiet grandeur, they capture the essence of an era when American capitalism was shaped not only by markets, but by the rooms in which its architects gathered. By the time the progressive era gathered full force, the private empire of J.P. Morgan stood at the center of a national reckoning. The estates that had once symbolized order and cultivated authority were increasingly interpreted as emblems of concentrated power. America was changing. Muckraking journalists exposed corporate excess, reformers demanded antitrust enforcement, and political leaders questioned whether industrial consolidation had gone too far. In this shifting landscape, Morgan's homes, his Madison Avenue residence, his private library, and his Hudson Valley retreat became silent witnesses to a transformation that would redefine the relationship between wealth and democracy. What had been designed as fortresses of discretion were now scrutinized as symbols of influence that extended beyond boardrooms into the very structure of national governance. The Pujo Committee hearings of 1912 crystallized this scrutiny. Convened by Congress to investigate the so-called money trust, the inquiry sought to determine whether a small group of bankers, led in perception if not always in fact by Morgan, exercised undue control over the nation's credit. Morgan himself testified, presenting a composed and deliberate defense of his practices. Yet while the hearings unfolded in Washington, the aura of his private estates hovered over the proceedings. Critics argued that decisions affecting millions were forged in secluded drawing rooms rather than public forums. The image of Morgan convening titans in his library during the Panic of 1907 became shorthand for a system that seemed to operate beyond electoral accountability. His estate culture, rooted in personal trust and private negotiation, clashed with the emerging demand for transparency within the walls of what is now the Morgan Library and Museum. Morgan had cultivated a world defined by scholarship and aesthetic refinement. The Renaissance ceilings and rare manuscripts projected continuity and civilization. Yet outside those walls, reformers saw an imbalance between private influence and public oversight. The hearings did not dismantle Morgan's empire overnight, but they signaled a shift in public sentiment. Authority would increasingly be codified in institutions rather than embodied in individuals. The Federal Reserve Act, signed into law in 1913, formalized a central banking system that institutionalized many functions Morgan had performed personally. In effect, the federal government absorbed elements of the stabilizing role he had enacted from his private spaces. Morgan did not live long enough to witness the full consequences of that transformation. He died in Rome in March 1913, just months before the Federal Reserve System began operation. Yet the evolution of his estates after his death offers a lens into how American society reinterpreted wealth. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., inherited both the firm, J.P. Morgan and Company, and the symbolic weight of the family's properties. During World War I, the younger Morgan arranged substantial loans to the Allied powers, reinforcing the firm's global reach. But the era of unquestioned private authority was fading. The post-war climate, and later the investigations following the Great Depression, deepened skepticism toward financial elites. The estates that once embodied stability now evoked debates about accountability. Yet even amid criticism, the cultural dimension of Morgan's private empire proved resilient. The library, gradually opened to scholars and eventually to the broader public, transformed from exclusive sanctuary to educational institution. Its collections, Gutenberg Bibles, illuminated manuscripts, and master drawings, became resources for research and inspiration. The very space that had been cited as evidence of insular power evolved into a civic asset. In this transformation lies one of the most compelling paradoxes of Morgan's legacy. The architecture of privacy ultimately became a platform for public engagement. What began as a symbol of personal dominion matured into a shared cultural inheritance. The Hudson River Estate, less visible in popular memory, also reflected this passage of time. As America urbanized and modernized, the country retreat lost its role as a financial command center. No longer did rival railroad executives gather there under Morgan's watchful gaze to settle disputes. Instead, the property stood as a relic of an era when personal presence dictated corporate outcomes. Its landscape, rolling lawns and commanding river views, echoed with the memory of conversations that once shaped industries. But those conversations had shifted into conference rooms governed by boards, regulations, and federal oversight. The estate remained, yet its function changed from active arena to historical testament. Internationally, the influence seated within Morgan's European residences continued to resonate. His firm's London connections endured through global conflicts and economic upheavals, shaping the contours of 20th century finance. The private networks cultivated in drawing rooms on both sides of the Atlantic evolved into formalized relationships between central banks and multinational institutions. Morgan's model of transatlantic coordination anticipated the interconnected financial systems that define modern globalization. In that sense, his estates were incubators of a broader transformation, where personal diplomacy foreshadowed institutional cooperation. Culturally, the aesthetic choices embedded in Morgan's properties also signaled a shift in American identity. By importing European art and architectural styles, he had sought to elevate American prestige. Over time, those imported traditions blended with emerging domestic confidence. The Morgan Library became not merely a repository of European heritage, but a symbol of American stewardship of global culture. Visitors no longer saw it as the private vault of a financier, but as an institution contributing to scholarship and public life. The evolution of perception mirrored the evolution of the nation itself, from industrial adolescence to global maturity, as the 20th century progressed. Subsequent generations of financiers operated within systems far more regulated than the one Morgan had navigated. Antitrust laws, securities regulations, and federal monetary policy reshaped the terrain. The mythic image of a single banker locking peers in a library until consensus was reached faded into history. Yet that image continues to captivate because it represents a transitional moment when private estates briefly served as instruments of national stabilization. The physical structures remain tangible reminders of a time when architecture and authority were inseparable. Today, to walk through the grand rooms of the Morgan Library is to encounter layers of meaning. The marble floors and gilded ceilings whisper of exclusivity, yet the open doors invite public curiosity. The building stands at the intersection of private ambition and public legacy. It embodies the tension between individual power and collective oversight that defined the progressive era. Meanwhile, the memory of Cragston lingers along the Hudson, a quieter monument to the personal networks that once governed American industry, section by section. The story of J.P. Morgan's estates reveals a deeper narrative about the evolution of power in America. They began as instruments of consolidation, places where authority was exercised face to face. They became symbols contested by reformers demanding transparency. And ultimately, they transformed into historical and cultural institutions that outlived the controversies of their creation. The Forgotten Empire was never solely about land or architecture. It was about the environment in which influence was shaped and reshaped. In the end, Morgan's private estates traced the arc of American capitalism from intimate negotiation to institutional governance. They remind us that power is both spatial and temporal, anchored in physical places yet subject to historical change. Within their walls, an era of personal dominance reached its zenith and yielded to systemic reform. And though the world that produced them has passed, the structures endure, standing as silent witnesses to the moment when private rooms carried the weight of a nation's destiny. In the years after the death of J.P. Morgan in 1913, the silence inside his private estates carried a different weight. The commanding presence that had once filled their rooms was gone, yet the architecture of influence remained intact, as if waiting to see whether the world would continue to revolve around it. Markets paused at news of his passing, an extraordinary gesture that reflected the scale of his authority. But within his Madison Avenue library and along the wooded slopes of his Hudson River retreat, the future was less certain. The empire he had constructed through personal discipline and strategic hospitality would now face the test of inheritance, of whether power rooted in personality could survive its founder, leadership of J.P. Morgan, and company passed to his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack. The transition was not merely corporate. It was symbolic. Jack inherited not only a banking empire, but the physical spaces that had defined his father's method of governance. Yet the younger Morgan operated in a world reshaped by reform. The Federal Reserve System, established the same year his father died, assumed many stabilizing functions once exercised privately from the Morgan Library. The era when a single financier could summon rivals behind closed doors to rescue the financial system had receded. Now, institutional authority replaced personal command. Still, the estates did not immediately lose relevance. During the First World War, Jack Morgan's firm became the principal purchasing agent for Britain and France in the United States, arranging vast loans that tied American finance to the Allied cause. Though many negotiations unfolded in formal offices, the culture of discretion cultivated within the Morgan properties continued to influence how business was conducted. Trust remained the firm's currency, and trust was a legacy forged in rooms where reputations were built face to face. The estates, though quieter, still symbolized continuity. The Madison Avenue Library, later formalized as the Morgan Library and Museum, entered a gradual transformation. Under the direction of Morgan's heirs, its collections were preserved with meticulous care, and access slowly expanded. Scholars gained entry to manuscripts once reserved for private contemplation. The building that had once represented exclusivity evolved into a research institution. Its Renaissance ceilings and rare volumes now served students and historians, reframing the Morgan name within the realm of cultural philanthropy rather than financial dominance. In this evolution, the estate shed some of its aura of secrecy and gained a new legitimacy grounded in education. Meanwhile, the Hudson River property, Cragston, became less central to the operations of modern finance. Without the elder Morgan's commanding presence, it no longer functioned as a neutral ground where rival magnates submitted to arbitration. Corporate governance had grown more complex, shaped by boards, regulators, and public scrutiny. The estate remained an emblem of an earlier epoch, when authority was consolidated in individuals rather than dispersed across institutions. Its manicured grounds and commanding views of the river evoked a time when economic order was imposed through personal will. But as decades passed, that model felt increasingly distant. The Great Depression of 1929 introduced a new chapter of reckoning for the Morgan legacy. Though the firm survived, public anger toward financial elites intensified. Congressional investigations in the 1930s scrutinized banking practices and contributed to sweeping reforms, including the Glass-Steagall Act. The Morgan name, once synonymous with stability, was now entangled in debates about speculation and systemic risk. The estates, particularly the library, stood as quiet counterpoints to this criticism. Within their walls, art and scholarship persisted, offering a narrative that balanced accusations of excess with evidence of cultural contribution. Over time, the Morgan banking empire itself evolved. In 1935, amid regulatory pressures, the firm split its commercial and investment banking operations, leading to the creation of Morgan Stanley. The consolidation that J.P. Morgan had championed gave way to structural division. This transformation mirrored the broader decentralization of financial power. The estates, originally conceived as anchors of centralized authority, now existed within a fragmented and regulated financial landscape. Their role was no longer operational but historical, yet history has a way of restoring perspective. As the 20th century advanced and the memory of the Gilded Age softened into scholarship, the estates regained a measure of admiration. The Morgan Library expanded physically and intellectually, eventually incorporating modern additions that complemented its original structure. Visitors no longer associated it primarily with the Panic of 1907 or the Money Trust hearings. Instead, they encountered exhibitions of rare manuscripts, musical scores, and literary archives. The building's narrative shifted from private stronghold to public treasure. It became a testament to the enduring value of preservation. In this transformation lies the quiet resilience of Morgan's private empire. Though stripped of its direct financial authority, it retained symbolic power. The architecture continued to communicate seriousness and permanence. The manuscripts still testified to centuries of human creativity. The estate had outlived controversy and adapted to a new purpose. In many ways, it achieved what Morgan himself might have intended: permanence beyond the volatility of markets. The broader American landscape also changed in ways that contextualized Morgan's era. The rise of multinational corporations, global capital flows, and digital finance rendered the image of a single banker commanding an industry from a drawing room almost quaint. Yet that very contrast heightened historical interest in his estates. They represent a transitional phase in capitalism, an age when industrial empires were consolidated through personal negotiation and stabilized through private intervention. The estates were laboratories of that model, physical embodiments of a philosophy that valued discipline, hierarchy, and cultivated authority. Today, when scholars analyze the evolution of American finance, they often return to the figure of J.P. Morgan as a bridge between chaos and regulation. His estates form part of that bridge. They remind us that economic systems are shaped not only by laws and markets, but by environments where ideas are exchanged and decisions are forged. The carved ceilings, the heavy wooden tables, the hushed corridors, all were participants in the drama of consolidation and reform. As sunlight filters through the windows of the Morgan Library, illuminating manuscripts once handled only by their collector, the forgotten empire reveals its final transformation. It is no longer a domain of exclusive power, but a public institution rooted in scholarship. The Hudson Estate, though quieter, remains a marker of the landscapes where American capitalism matured. Together, these properties chart the arc of a legacy that moved from private command to shared inheritance. The story of Section 7 is not one of decline, but of evolution. Morgan's estates did not crumble with his death. They adapted. They shifted from command centers to cultural landmarks, from arenas of negotiation to spaces of reflection. In their endurance, they capture the paradox of concentrated power, that while authority may fade, the structures built to contain it can assume new meaning. Through stone and parchment, through architecture and art, the empire of J.P. Morgan continues to speak, not as a ruler of markets, but as a chapter in the long narrative of American ambition and transformation. By the middle of the 20th century, the physical remnants of J.P. Morgan's private empire stood like monuments from another age, their meanings subtly reshaped by time. The world that had once depended on a single financier's authority had given way to institutions, regulations, and global frameworks that diffused power across systems rather than concentrating it within individuals. Yet the spaces Morgan built, his Madison Avenue Library, his Hudson River Retreat, his carefully curated residences, did not vanish into obscurity. Instead, they entered a new phase of historical consciousness, becoming artifacts through which later generations would interpret the Gilded Age and its transformation into modern capitalism. What had once functioned as operational centers of influence were now stages upon which history itself was examined. The Morgan Library, long preserved by his heirs, gradually expanded its mission beyond private scholarship. Renamed and reorganized as the Morgan Library and Museum, it became a cornerstone of New York's cultural landscape. Architectural additions in the 21st century integrated modern design with the original Renaissance-inspired structure, symbolizing the blending of past and present. Visitors who stepped through its doors encountered not the austere secrecy of a banker's sanctum, but curated exhibitions spanning literature, music, and visual art. Medieval manuscripts shared space with drafts by Charles Dickens and original scores by Mozart. In this evolution, the estate completed a remarkable transition from fortress of financial authority to beacon of intellectual access. The very rooms once associated with crisis meetings during the Panic of 1907 now hosted school groups and scholars, reframing Morgan's legacy through education rather than economic dominance. Yet the transformation was not merely architectural. It was narrative. Historians began reassessing Morgan's role with greater nuance. The simplistic caricature of a monopolistic titan yielded to a more layered portrait of a man operating within the volatile conditions of rapid industrialization. The estates provided tangible entry points for this reassessment. Standing within the library's opulent interior, one senses the deliberate message Morgan intended to convey: order, continuity, civilization. His collecting habits were not impulsive displays of wealth, but calculated assertions that American finance could be aligned with European cultural heritage. The manuscripts and paintings were arguments in material form, suggesting that industrial power should be balanced by aesthetic responsibility. Meanwhile, the broader Morgan financial empire underwent its own metamorphosis. The firm, originally known as J.P. Morgan and Company, adapted to regulatory reforms and global expansion, eventually evolving through mergers and restructurings into the modern financial institutions that carry the Morgan name today. The decentralized, multinational corporation that emerged bore little resemblance to the tightly controlled enterprise once overseen from a single library table. Yet the symbolic lineage remained intact. Corporate headquarters and philanthropic initiatives often reference the heritage of stability and prudence associated with the elder Morgan. In this way, the physical estates continued to exert influence, not through direct governance, but through institutional memory. The Hudson River Estate, though less accessible to the public eye, lingered in the cultural imagination as a vestige of an era when landscapes were enlisted in the service of authority. Its commanding views and deliberate seclusion spoke of a time when proximity to power required invitation and discretion. As suburban development expanded and the rhythms of modern life accelerated, such estates became rarer and more emblematic of a bygone elite culture. Preservationists and historians recognized their architectural and historical value, even as their original function faded. They became symbols of how personal authority once intersected with geography, how physical space could amplify the influence of an individual. Culturally, the endurance of Morgan's estates paralleled America's evolving relationship with wealth. The mid-20th century saw a growing emphasis on corporate social responsibility and philanthropy as mechanisms for legitimizing economic power. Foundations, museums, and universities became vehicles through which private fortunes sought public impact. In this climate, the Morgan Library stood as an early example of how private collection could transition into public institution. Its survival and expansion offered a template for integrating heritage with accessibility. The narrative shifted from exclusivity to stewardship. At the same time, popular fascination with the Gilded Age intensified. Books, documentaries, and exhibitions revisited the titans of industry, exploring both their achievements and controversies. Within these narratives, Morgan's estates served as evocative backdrops. They illustrated how power was exercised not only through contracts and stock exchanges, but through carefully managed environments. The image of Morgan summoning bankers into his library during financial crisis retained its dramatic resonance. Yet it was increasingly contextualized within a broader understanding of systemic instability and institutional evolution. The estates thus functioned as interpretive tools, helping audiences visualize the human dimension of economic history. The international dimension of Morgan's legacy also endured. His transatlantic networks, once nurtured in London drawing rooms and reinforced through personal diplomacy, foreshadowed the interconnected global finance of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. While modern markets operate at digital speed, the foundations of trust and credibility remain essential. The estates remind us that such foundations were once built through conversation and presence rather than algorithms and screens. They underscore the continuity between past and present forms of influence. Even as the mechanisms have changed in contemporary New York, the Morgan Library stands amid skyscrapers that symbolize the modern financial system. The contrast is striking. Glass towers rise where telegraphs once clicked, and electronic trades replace handwritten agreements. Yet within the library's preserved interior, time appears suspended. The gilded ceilings and marble columns recall a moment when American capitalism sought legitimacy through cultural alignment. That juxtaposition between technological modernity and historic preservation captures the enduring tension at the heart of Morgan's empire. Innovation anchored by tradition, ultimately. Section 8 reveals how the forgotten empire did not disappear, but transformed into a living archive. Its power shifted from direct intervention to interpretive resonance. The estates became places where visitors could contemplate the origins of modern finance, where scholars could trace the lineage of manuscripts rescued from obscurity, and where architecture itself narrated a story of ambition and adaptation. They stand as reminders that influence leaves physical traces, that the rooms in which decisions are made can outlast the decisions themselves. As the sun sets over Manhattan and light filters through the windows of the Morgan Library, the building continues its quiet dialogue with history. It no longer commands markets or compels rival magnates to compromise. Instead, it invites reflection. The forgotten empire of J.P. Morgan's private estates has become a bridge between eras, connecting the age of personal financial sovereignty with the age of institutional governance. Through preservation and reinterpretation, those estates endure, not as relics of unchecked authority, but as spaces where the complex legacy of American capitalism can be studied, questioned, and understood as the 21st century unfolds. The legacy of J.P. Morgan's private estates occupies a paradoxical position in American memory, at once distant and deeply present. The age of railroad consolidations and gold shipments arranged in candlelit rooms has long passed, yet the architecture of that era continues to shape how power is imagined. The Madison Avenue Library, preserved and expanded as the Morgan Library and Museum, now stands not as a command center of financial rescue, but as a sanctuary of scholarship in the heart of Manhattan. Its walls, once privy to urgent conversations about liquidity and confidence, now host exhibitions on literary drafts, musical compositions, and illuminated texts. The transformation is striking. What was once a fortress of private influence has become a public forum for cultural reflection, and yet, beneath this transformation lies continuity. Modern finance may operate through digital platforms and global institutions, but the fundamental elements of trust, reputation, and negotiation remain intact. Morgan's era reminds us that economic systems are not abstract machines. They are human constructs sustained by relationships. His estates were environments deliberately designed to cultivate those relationships. In the 21st century, corporate boardrooms and international summits fulfill similar functions, though stripped of the personal grandeur that defined the Gilded Age. The library's preserved interiors offer a rare physical reminder that before regulatory frameworks and central banks formalized stability, it was enforced through personal authority. Exercised within carefully curated spaces, the evolution of J.P. Morgan and Company into the global financial institutions that exist today underscores how dramatically the landscape has changed. Mergers, regulatory reforms, and technological innovation have reshaped the firm beyond recognition from its 19th century origins. Yet the Morgan name persists as a symbol of prudence and longevity. Corporate branding often invokes stability and heritage, qualities deeply associated with the elder Morgan's disciplined persona and the environments he controlled. In subtle ways, the image of the private library, the quiet confidence of a man seated beneath Renaissance ceilings, still informs perceptions of institutional strength. Meanwhile, public fascination with the Gilded Age has intensified. Documentaries, biographies, and academic studies revisit figures like Morgan to interrogate the roots of modern inequality and corporate power. Within these narratives, his estates function as visual shorthand for concentrated influence. The image of bankers locked in a room during the Panic of 1907 continues to captivate audiences, symbolizing both decisive leadership and troubling centralization. As economic crises in recent decades have revived debates about systemic risk and government intervention, Morgan's example has resurfaced in commentary, sometimes praised as decisive stewardship, sometimes criticized as oligarchic dominance. The estates provide tangible evidence of that era's ethos, grounding abstract debates in physical reality. Culturally, the Morgan Library's expanded programming reflects a democratization of access unimaginable in Morgan's lifetime. Students wander through galleries once restricted to select guests. Scholars consult manuscripts that were once guarded as private treasures. The institution's evolution mirrors a broader societal shift toward transparency and inclusivity. Yet the building's architectural integrity ensures that visitors still feel the gravity of its origins. Marble columns and gilded ornamentation frame contemporary exhibitions, reminding observers that public institutions often arise from private ambition. The Hudson River Estate, though less prominent in the public imagination, continues to symbolize the geographic dimension of power. In an age of remote communication and virtual transactions, it is almost difficult to conceive that entire industries were once reorganized through in-person discussions on secluded grounds. The estate evokes a slower tempo of negotiation, when decisions unfolded over days rather than milliseconds. It stands as a testament to the embodied nature of authority in the Gilded Age, when proximity was essential and presence commanded obedience. That contrast highlights the transformation of capitalism from personal enterprise to algorithmic network. Internationally, Morgan's transatlantic model anticipated the interconnected financial systems that define globalization. His relationships with European bankers, cultivated in private residences and reinforced through mutual trust, prefigured the collaborative frameworks that govern central banks today. While contemporary coordination occurs through formal institutions and digital communication, the underlying principle of cross-border partnership remains consistent. The estates, in this sense, are architectural fossils of globalization's earliest phase, when personal diplomacy laid the groundwork for international finance. As historians reassess Morgan's life, they increasingly emphasize complexity over caricature. He was neither the villainous monopolist of populist rhetoric nor the infallible savior of conservative legend. His estates capture that duality. They were spaces of exclusion, where decisions affecting millions were made without public participation. Yet they were also spaces of preservation, where art and knowledge were safeguarded for future generations. This tension mirrors the broader contradictions of American capitalism: innovation intertwined with inequality, ambition shadowed by controversy. Walking through the Morgan Library today, one senses the layering of narratives. The hushed atmosphere evokes the disciplined intensity of its founder, while the open doors signal a commitment to shared cultural heritage. The building has become a palimpsest, bearing traces of financial drama beneath its scholarly calm. Visitors may admire a medieval manuscript without realizing that in the same room, a century earlier, Morgan confronted bankers reluctant to contribute to a rescue fund. The estate contains multitudes: art and urgency, privacy and public service. In reflecting on the forgotten empire of J.P. Morgan's private estates, it becomes clear that their true significance lies not in opulence, but in transition. They mark the passage from a period when individual financiers wielded extraordinary influence to an era defined by institutional checks and balances. They illustrate how architecture can serve as both instrument and archive of power. And they remind us that even as systems evolve, the human impulse to gather in deliberate spaces, to negotiate, persuade, and preserve, endures. Section 9 thus reveals an enduring resonance. The estates no longer command markets or dictate credit flows, yet they continue to shape historical consciousness. They stand as reminders that American capitalism was once guided from rooms lined with ancient texts and illuminated by gaslight. In those rooms, authority was concentrated, contested, and ultimately transformed. Today, amid skyscrapers and digital exchanges, the quiet grandeur of Morgan's properties invites reflection on how far the system has traveled and how much of its foundation was laid within walls built for one man's vision of order and permanence. In the end, the forgotten empire of J.P. Morgan's private estates is not a story of vanished wealth, but of transformed power. The stone facades still stand, the manuscripts still rest beneath carefully controlled light, and the echoes of decisive conversations linger in rooms now open to the public. Yet the world those estates once governed has irreversibly changed. The age when a single financier could summon rivals into his library and stabilize a collapsing market through personal authority alone belongs to a different chapter of American history. What remains is something subtler, but perhaps more enduring: the architecture of influence converted into the architecture of memory. When Morgan died in 1913, he left behind not merely a banking house, but a constellation of physical spaces that embodied his philosophy of order. His Madison Avenue residence and adjoining library, today preserved as the Morgan Library and Museum, had been designed as sanctuaries of discipline and scholarship. Within those walls, Renaissance art and medieval manuscripts formed a deliberate counterpoint to the volatility of industrial capitalism. Morgan believed that wealth required cultural grounding, that authority demanded aesthetic legitimacy. The library was his answer to the charge that American finance lacked refinement. It declared that industry and intellect could coexist, that capital could preserve civilization as well as accumulate it. Over time, the meaning of that declaration shifted. The Panic of 1907, once cited as evidence of Morgan's indispensable leadership, came to symbolize the dangers of relying on private authority in moments of public crisis. The creation of the Federal Reserve System institutionalized the stabilizing role he had assumed from his private estate, embedding it within a framework of national governance. As regulatory structures matured and corporate oversight expanded, the necessity of personal financial monarchs diminished. Morgan's estates thus became markers of a transitional era, when capitalism hovered between individual dominance and systemic regulation. The evolution of J.P. Morgan and Company mirrored this transformation. Through restructurings, regulatory adjustments, and eventual mergers that shaped the modern financial landscape, the firm adapted to an increasingly complex global economy. Yet the legacy of its founder persisted as a symbol of steadiness. Corporate narratives often evoke the elder Morgan's decisiveness during crisis, reinforcing an image of stability rooted in history. Even as algorithms replaced handwritten ledgers and international summits replaced intimate dinners, the aura of disciplined authority remained associated with his name. Meanwhile, the estates themselves transitioned from instruments of influence to institutions of interpretation. The Morgan Library expanded, welcoming visitors into a space once guarded by invitation. Architectural renovations integrated contemporary design while preserving the original interiors, allowing modern audiences to experience the atmosphere Morgan had curated. The building became both museum and monument, an embodiment of cultural continuity amid urban transformation. School children and scholars alike now walk through rooms where titans of industry once negotiated the fate of railroads and trust companies. In that juxtaposition lies the profound shift from exclusivity to accessibility. The Hudson River Estate, though less publicly visible, retains its symbolic resonance. Its sweeping landscapes and deliberate seclusion evoke an era when proximity defined power. Decisions were made in person, trust was built through shared presence, and authority radiated from carefully controlled environments. In an age defined by instantaneous communication and digital finance, such spaces seem almost anachronistic. Yet they remind us that systems are shaped by human interaction, that even the most abstract economic structures once depended on conversations held across polished tables. The enduring fascination with Morgan's estates reflects broader questions about wealth and responsibility. Was he a stabilizer who prevented chaos, or a consolidator who concentrated influence too narrowly? The estates themselves do not answer this question. They complicate it. Within their walls, art was preserved and industries reorganized. Manuscripts that might have been dispersed were safeguarded, even as corporations were consolidated into powerful trusts. The same rooms that sheltered cultural treasures also hosted decisions affecting millions of livelihoods. This duality defines Morgan's legacy and the era he helped shape. In contemporary discourse, where debates about inequality and corporate power once again command attention, Morgan's story resonates anew. His private empire offers a historical lens through which to examine the balance between innovation and oversight. It illustrates how authority can stabilize and destabilize in equal measure. And it demonstrates that the spaces where power is exercised matter profoundly. Architecture is never neutral. It frames behavior, signals hierarchy, and shapes perception. Morgan understood this instinctively. His estates were constructed not only to house him, but to amplify his presence. Today, as visitors stand beneath the gilded ceilings of the Morgan Library, they encounter more than rare books. They encounter a narrative about the maturation of American capitalism. The library's preservation affirms that private ambition can yield public benefit, even if born in controversy. It stands as evidence that legacy is not static. What begins as exclusive dominion can evolve into shared heritage. The forgotten empire, once defined by privacy and concentration, now thrives through openness and scholarship. Section 10, then, brings the story full circle. J.P. Morgan's estates began as extensions of his will, places where he enforced order, cultivated alliances, and asserted cultural legitimacy. They survived the transition from Gilded Age dominance to progressive reform, from personal governance to institutional oversight. They weathered the skepticism of the Great Depression and the modernization of global finance. And in their endurance, they transformed from command centers into custodians of history. The empire was never truly lost. It simply changed form. Its authority no longer dictates markets, but its presence continues to inform how we understand power, legacy, and the spaces that bind them together. In stone and marble, in parchment and paint, the story persists. And as long as those rooms stand, quiet now, but alive with memory, the forgotten empire of J.P. Morgan's private estates will remain a testament to an age when the fate of a nation could be shaped not only by numbers on a ledger, but by the silence of a room and the resolve of the man who occupied it.